While Benn Stancil is busy running his analytics company called Mode, he's also reaching out to a dedicated following of over 12,000 data and analytics followers every Friday through his thoroughly researched and entertaining Substack posts. Welcome to another episode of It Depends. I'm sure many of you are already enthralled by Ben's deep thinking of our industry because he has a reputation for not mincing words and saying things that many of us are thinking, but we haven't yet put it to an eloquent phrase, or maybe we are too shy to say so. So, Ben, obviously we had to have a chat. I find there is so much depth hidden behind your sardonic portrayal of our industry that we'll benefit from listening to you. I consider you the savant of our industry. So welcome to this episode.
Thanks for having me. That is a more than kind introduction. Not one I can probably live up to here, but I'll do my best.
You will do more than that, I'm sure. So I have literally a truckload of questions for you. So let's get started. And the first, for those who don't know you, and I'm sure there are very few who watch this who won't know you, but can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Ben. I currently am one of the founders of Mode. Mode is a BI company designed around data teams. Prior to that, so my background was I did like math and economics and stuff like that. Worked in Washington, D.C. At a think tank doing like econ research for a little bit, which is kind of like an analytics job, but just in a different industry. It was basically the same ideas as like, here's a bunch of data, figure out ways to solve problems, make policy recommendations, which essentially is the same as like what data teams do. But instead of making recommendations for a product team or a marketing team, we were telling like the Fed what to do. The Fed did not care what we thought they should do. But that was like our job was basically the same thing as that. And then 10 years or so ago, I ended up moving to San Francisco, starting working on analytics jobs and things like that, and very much what kind of looks like kind of the modern data teams. And then ultimately ended up meeting a couple of folks there and starting Mode and been doing that ever since.
Very nice. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I'm so excited. I want to start asking you some questions about analytics or BI space, since that's a space you are in. So, Ben, I feel that we're stuck in time when it comes to BI. It's like data analytics is such a happening space. In fact, sometimes I feel if we have a Wayback Machine and we go back to business objects pitch deck from 1993, it'll be as relevant today as it was then. How do you see analytics changing? And like, what are the three things that you think would get analytics to have a buzz in the market?
I mean, so there's a lot of things like, I think you're right that it is very similar, but in some ways it's sort of like this modern version of the same old stuff. And to me, there are a lot of things that are different now. It's a lot easier to get things set up. There's a lot more tools that basically anybody can start using them. It used to be that the folks that had sort of like the as you said, sort of the MicroStrategy type of pitch decks or the business objects type of type of products, it was a much more expensive thing to get done. And so now that's accessible to anybody. Like if you're a 5-person company, you can actually have those sorts of tools that used to just be for AT&T, which I think is a really big change. It is interesting though that we haven't really changed like what BI is. Like it's kind of fundamentally looks the same. It's some dashboards and some drag and drop charts and things like that. Part of my answer to like why that is that because data has become more accessible, it's attracted a bunch of people like me who frankly don't know the history. Like there's a bunch of people who got into it who didn't have to learn what BI looked like 20 years ago. It's like, oh, we just know a little bit of SQL. Sure, we can do this. And so when you do that, you become like very detached from like what came before. And so you end up kind of solving a lot of the same problems that were solved 20 years ago because you like never bothered to read the history and never bothered to figure out like what had already been done before. And so like you see this kind of in like the semantic layer stuff, which I think is a good development. I'm excited for it. I think it's like there are actually a lot of reasons why it is a considerable change from where it was with like the thing that DBT is doing. But there's a lot of people who occasionally be like, haven't we been doing this for the last 20 years? And the answer is like, yeah, kind of. And part of that is, I think, like a new cohort of people who are coming into data and analytics that are coming from all these different backgrounds that don't actually have that history. They've only been here for 5 or 10 years and don't actually know what people were doing in 1993. And so we end up, for better or for worse, I think, like repeating some of the same problems. I think that's like okay that we end up reinventing them and figure out new ways to do them, but also it's like sort of not, it's not this always progressing forward thing where we're always learning something new. We're always kind of like building on the frontier. There is some like going backwards because of that to me.
Do you see that the usage of BI tools is going to increase? And if so, is there some area of our industry that's underserved by BI today?
I think so. So I think there's a fair bit. So it's hard to imagine that it doesn't, the usage of BI goes down, or that we don't see more it becoming more of a popular thing. Partly because it's becoming such a standard that this is the way we think about businesses. That everybody has come around to the idea that like to run a business, we need to be looking at analytics. We need to be thinking about like what's happening on the ground. That it has to be, I don't want to say like data driven, but it has to be sort of data informed. And so it's hard to imagine that really taking a big step back. I think that places where like it's underserved is essentially how do you make it accessible to people that don't have data teams in place, that don't have big investments there, that can actually like sort of do this stuff well, without having to go out and hire a whole bunch of experts and things like that. Because we still feel like there's a lot of companies who can set up BI, but like how valuable is it if you don't have those folks in place? It's not quite there yet, I would say. And so it's like really delivering on a lot of the value to me of what BI can be if you don't have kind of that expertise.
So I remember some days ago we were talking and you mentioned something very interesting, something that you said the BI tools were made for data consumers, but there's a part of, like the data producers typically don't use BI tools. Is that correct?
Yeah, so this was actually one of the reasons we started Node, was there was this kind of split in the market for data tools where there was BI, like classic BI, and tools that were designed for executives, for marketers, for kind of like the business user, however you want to classify that. And they've been through 100 different names of what that looks like. And they were very much the kind of drag and drop tools. They were designed for like accessing data for you have I want to pull this data that, you know, is some simple kind of question, basically. Very powerful because you can answer a ton of questions that way. But if you're an analyst or data scientist, you're asking these questions that are typically much more complex. You're the one who, when there's a number that's going down on the dashboard, you're the one that gets the email from the executive in the middle of the night that's like, why is this going down? We need to know by tomorrow morning. And you've got to go dig in and like really figure out what's going on that goes well beyond just like what a few charts will show you. And so those two things tend to exist in separate worlds, where it was analysts were working in sort of code first tools. They tended to be SQL tools or RStudio or Jupyter notebooks or whatever. And then there were like the BI tools that were kind of the accessible ones for everybody else. And to me, and this is something that a lot of folks have kind of talked about, is like those two places or two worlds are very much being brought together. That things like analytics engineers or data teams that are not traditional kind of IT data teams, but are more like embedded business teams, start to really blend like what's a technical analyst versus a business user versus so what's a BI tool versus like an analytics tool. And so really, I think the way that like BI can really evolve is like bringing those two worlds truly together, where when you have a question, you think of like, all right, I go to one place to answer that question. I don't think of, do I want to answer it with SQL and Python? Therefore, I'll go to tool A. Do I want to answer it in like our dashboards? I'll go to tool B. Like you shouldn't have to have that. You shouldn't have to think through that when you're deciding that. It shouldn't be like,
right.
I use Google Docs if I'm like taking some notes, or do I use a different thing if I'm like writing up a longer doc to share? Like it's weird if you have to make that choice. You kind of want to have one thing to do both.
It's fascinating just hearing what you're saying, because it seems like there is melding of roles, tools that can be multifaceted instead of business analysts use this tool, data producers use that tool, data scientists use a different tool. So why have so many different proliferation of tools when you can have one way that people can sort of uniformly go and access data?
Yeah, and to me, I would say a good thing and a bad thing there. The good thing is, or like the good thing, but like that's the dream to me, is you have one sort of uniform way to do this. You have like one easy way that is, again, it doesn't really matter what your persona is, in part because those personas aren't well defined anymore. That if you are a operations analyst, like what side of that do you sit on? Like I don't know, and it's weird for you to have to choose. One time the job I'm using the BI tool, the other side, like you don't want to have to do that. There's a kind of the spectrum, and you want the tool to sort of serve across the spectrum. The thing that I think is tricky here is what BI really is to me is it's the interface between like data and technology to people. And people are going to be very different. And you can't have like a uniform interface into people. Like they're going to have different needs. They're going to have different ways of thinking. They're going to have different abilities. They're going to have different problems they're solving. And so in some ways, I think the proliferation of like BI tools or sort of BI shaped tools makes some sense because it's the way that different people think. Like if you're a finance person, you are going to think differently than someone who is an engineer. And not just like you have different sort of modes of thinking. You're trying to solve different problems. The ways that you want to like capture the business is going to look different. You're going to want to do very different things. And so it sort of makes sense to have different interfaces for the person who's trying to do financial projections versus the person who's trying to debug an issue. And so like, should we have one tool that actually can do all those things? Like ideally, yeah, but in practice, it's sort of difficult to imagine like an interface that can handle all of those things that well.
Yeah. In all the spaces that I cover, there's a massive influx of new products and tools. But I have to say that BI space is the original place that got super crowded very early on. But then we've also seen things like, Tableau's acquisition by Salesforce. I was just seeing on LinkedIn last week, there was an Irish wake because Tableau people think Salesforce has killed Tableau, and then Click bought Talent. So what's going on in this space? Why is it so crowded? And why are they, it seems like they're having some sort of like an existential crisis, some of these companies.
I mean, I guess there's a few ways to maybe think about that. And I'd kind of be interested in your take on some of this stuff, where part of it is probably just like market pressure and consolidation. It's just that like there are tons of tools. There's sort of too many tools for not a big enough market. Like the BI market is very big. It's not big enough to have 30 companies. Like it's just that unless these things are very specialized. So I think part of it is just that. And obviously with the state of the economy now, like some pressure for consolidation around that. Part of it, I think, is the proliferation is because people are all going to have these different ideas. There's always what feels like wedges. You can always be like, oh, we're a BI tool that does things really well for this particular use case. And because everybody's trying to do slightly different things, you can kind of create that wedge where it's like, oh, we are the BI tool for this particular thing. And then we can expand over time. And then we'll become like a generalized BI tool and all that. And I think like the market is fragmented enough that the wedge makes sense, but then the expansion gets really hard. And so you end up with these like small pieces that aren't big enough to sort of stand alone, that can kind of pull in different directions, and it all sort of gets messy. So I think that's like, there's always a draw. There's always something that doesn't seem like it solves something very well. There's always places where you can look at it and be like, this doesn't seem like it's doing the job completely. Let's go try to solve that problem that feels underserved. And then when you solve it and it's like, well, it's not really big enough for it to stand on its own. Okay, we have to expand into kind of being more classic BI. Now suddenly we're competing with everybody else. So I think it's a little bit of like the dynamic of a messy market like that. The other thing one other part of this, I was talking to someone about this before about BI, and there's a general sense in tech, it seems like, that everything tends toward like a winner take all. That ultimately there should be like the Salesforce that is the thing that dominates CRM. And obviously there's other CRMs, but like it's the one that everybody sort of chooses. Or there should be, this is the tool that people use for whatever. Or maybe there's a couple, but like for the most part, there is this kind of like winner take most. It's also possible to me that like BI is more like a car market where there's actually no winner take all. Like the car market is very fragmented. And it's like, sure, there's some big companies and smaller companies, but we don't really expect it to be like, why hasn't Toyota just built all the cars?
Yeah.
It's like we realize there's people are gonna have different choices, there's gonna be different preferences, there's always gonna be a market for a bunch of different kinds of cars. Sure, some will do better than others, but like no car maker is gonna be 60% of the car market. It's just not gonna happen. And like I think BI could in some ways be that, where it's more of a car market where there's just so many different types of buyers that no one company could conceivably be 60% of the BI market.
Yeah. Actually, car market is a very interesting space that you mentioned, because I've been looking at it from sort of a data products analogy, and in my research I found there were literally hundreds of car companies when Henry Ford came out with Model T in 1930s, 20s, 30s,
Yeah.
and then the number reduced to like a few scores from hundreds. And then by the 1960s, when GM, Chrysler, and Ford were big, they were literally down to single digit companies. So
yeah, and that like I remember seeing something like where there was like the car market it was an enormous number, and it didn't end up lasting that. But it doesn't feel like it's consolidated nearly to the degree that, and in some ways, even if it's the car market itself, it's like there's a lot of different kinds of cars. Yeah. Even if GE or GM rather owns lots of different brands and stuff like that, like buyers sort of need preference. And so it feels like to me there may be something in that, which is like, hey, buyers have different things. Like,
yes,
you gotta have a car for the electrician that needs a truck, you gotta have a car for the parent that needs a van, you gotta have a car for the guy who's having a midlife crisis and needs a sports car. Like you can't be like one car for all these people.
Yeah, very true. And Ben, you were asking me about some of my thoughts, and that leads me to I was just thinking out loud, and I was like, when I first got into the data and analytics space, for example, way back, SQL Server Analysis Server, MicroStrategy, Cognos, they were not just BI tools, but they also had the data modeling component, even Click, create like an OLAP model. But now I'm starting to see the OLAP models are sort of disaggregating, and semantic layers. DBT announced their semantic layer. AtScale has its own. So what is the purpose of BI? Because it seems like BI is becoming visualization. The semantic layers are going one place. OLAP, maybe OLAP will go away or not. It's not going to go away for sure. But so what's the role of a BI tool in this disaggregated environment or decoupled environment?
My view of it is that BI becomes more about visualization and collaboration and distribution. That what DBT is doing, and DBT did with sort of the core DBT product, was the first step of this, but it's sort of pulling out a lot of logic that typically lived in a BI tool, and now it's like an independent thing. And so the first step of that was pulling out what amounts to like join logic and things like that. Obviously, it's not quite that because they're just like materializing tables, but in effect, you can create a bunch of like, hey, we now have a customers table that has all the stuff joined on it or whatever. So they started to basically pull out what was some semantic layer stuff into a more centralized place. And now with their actual semantic layer, they're trying to do a lot more of that. And they just bought Transform, which is sort of a fully baked semantic layer that they want to I assume put into DBT. And so that becomes where you have like the entire semantic piece that used to be in BI is now independent and can connect to other things through APIs or through kind of some sort of templated SQL or whatever. I don't know. To me, what that means is actually a good thing for BI, because it lets BI focus on just like, how do we expose data to people? How do we help them understand what it means? How do we make sure they're being able to like find the things they're looking for? How do we make sure they can share it with the right people they need to talk to or share it with? How do we make sure they can collaborate about it? Like, there's a whole bunch of problems there about like creating a chart is the very beginning of the problem, not the end. It's like, okay, now what do we do with it? How do we learn more from it? How do we track it over time? Whatever those cases are. And so I think like BI becomes much more focused on how do we consume and actually like make sense of this stuff, as opposed to, well, we're going to spend half our time like building a model that lets us do the basic charts and then hope people can figure out what to do after that. So I actually think it's a good direction,
Yeah.
but it'll take some figuring out. And so like another version of this is, to me, is like, it's the thing that everybody's talking about, Ravi, but like the OpenAI, like ChatGPT type of stuff.
Yes.
How does that work with BI? And not saying specifically, like there's very obvious things like we'll put that on top of BI and ask questions. Not necessarily that, but like clearly there should be new interaction models here. And so BI, I think, will become much more focused on like, what does that interaction model look like, rather than, okay, well, how do we model the data underneath?
This is fascinating. So, Ben, I had this theory that the next 12 to 24 months, we're going to rethink how we do data, data workloads and outcomes. And, ChatGPT, in spite of whatever people are saying about ChatGPT, good or bad, I think it'll have a huge impact. Once we go through some initial kinks. Data products is another area. But before we even go to data mesh, data products, another thing that struck me when I was listening to you was how you were saying the BI tool is for visualization, collaboration is where you discover what data assets you have. Now, that discovery typically used to be a function of a data catalog. So I also have this idea that the data catalogs can no longer be sort of sitting on the side. They need to be embedded into the visualization tool, so they're in line rather than out of band. And then there's the whole marketplace. And so any thoughts on that? Is like the overlap of data catalogs and BI tools?
So the data catalog space to me is like a tricky one, and there's a bunch of things that are data catalog-ish. There's things that are straight up data catalogs that they sit on top of your data, and you're like, this is what this field means, and you like look up tables and that sort of stuff. There is sort of like data discovery, which is more about, okay, how are various data assets connected together? Who's using what? There's a model in dbt that's connected to this dashboard and mode that's connected to this Slack thing over here or whatever. And like, sort of building these kind of multi-tool lineages across the things. There's like observability, which kind of is catalog-ish in some ways because it sort of tracks the same lineage and tells you what's going on in these things. My view is like catalogs are in a little bit of they get squeezed from a lot of directions because they are not the source of truth of like what this data is and how it's defined is DBT or some layer that looks like it's the semantic layer. Like that is where the code gets defined. What that thing says is true. What your catalog says is trying to be a reflection of what that thing says. And so like that thing can always do a better job of telling you what the data is because it's the place that like the code is written. How it's used is the BI tool. Like the BI tool is the source of truth for how that stuff is used. If you want to know what's popular, like the BI tool is the point of consumption for all of it. So like the catalog is essentially just trying to ingest a bunch of information from other tools, but it itself doesn't actually have anything that's particularly unique. And so in one telling of that, I think like if there really is a lot of market pressure to consolidate or people don't want to buy very many tools, it's very hard to me for a catalog to make a lot of sense because you have to buy the BI tool, you have to buy the DBT, you have to buy the warehouse. The catalog is kind of a nice to have. So I think it's like, and why not just put it in the BI tool and have the BI tool that already knows a bunch of the stuff do it? Or why not have DBT do it, which they kind of have built light versions of this, but over time, you could certainly imagine expanding that way.
So the way I see it is that why not put it in BI tool? But when you put that metadata, that is a catalog. So in my mind that, how we discussed how there's a consolidation needs to happen between BI, AI, roles. I think we also need to sort of coexist data and metadata. So we not only do, like you were saying, the building of metadata, but also the runtime. So it's not like you use catalog to build and now you go to BI for runtime. I think these two need to be just one and the same.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, the argument to me for the data catalog is you got a bunch of tools and they're all a mess, and something has to kind of bring it together. Like there has to be something that sort of these tools don't really talk to each other terribly well. And how do you actually have something that says we can turn this mess of things into something coherent? And I can see the argument for that, but it doesn't seem like a terribly strong one over time. And I think, like, to me, the prep, and obviously this, a lot of people have tried this, and it's very hard to be like, let's make a standard, right? But I think the thing that actually works long-term better is there's an understanding of how this metadata all gets sort of handed around, and the BI tool and the transformation tool can just like interact with each other directly without having a data catalog or some observability, or not observability, some like data discovery thing sitting in the middle as an intermediary. And so in some ways,
it needs to be transparent, abstract.
Yeah. And in some ways, like a catalog might be victims of their own success, where you could imagine if a catalog comes along and becomes really popular, what they essentially are doing is saying every tool should provide data to us in a particular format. And as soon as they create that standardization, the BI tool may be like, well, we can just use that same standard. That's now become the main thing. Why don't we just build our own catalog on top of that? And nothing else needs to integrate with the catalog anymore, because we've kind of consolidated around this idea of how to actually sort of hand this metadata around in the ecosystem. So I think like it's a tricky space. I know there are some companies that have been reasonably successful there, and I'm sure they will be, there will be successful companies, but is it ever going to be nearly as big as like kind of these bigger poles of, data pipelines, data storage, BI? It's hard for me to see that it would be.
I see. So this is how reason, going back to how I was saying, I see a transformation happening. If we buy into the decentralized development for data products, then what I think is going to happen is that the business owners will take accountability for the data they have. So let's say I'm marketing department and I need to create a product for customers. Yeah. Now the data I've collected from a HubSpot, from Marketer, from Salesforce, from SAP, Oracle, whatever it may be. So I've combined it, but now that data product is going to be used by Mode to visualize and run your dashboard. It can be used by maybe Data Robot to do ML models. It can be used by somebody else to do a customer propensity or customer churn model. But the product kind of becomes the root where I'm guaranteed some, trust. And then I've got BI, AI, ML models. They're all like hanging off it. So the question that I have for you is, do you buy into this whole idea of data product? Are your customers asking for data product, the CDOs, or you think this is not feasible?
So in terms of our customers, we hear things about data products, but typically in kind of we read about it, we want it, we don't know what it is. That there is I don't know, you on every like tech company earnings call, every analyst seems to ask people like, so how are you going to use AI? Yeah. And like, there's not really an answer. There's not really a question that has an answer. It's sort of just like, this is the thing everybody's talking about. Like, you're going to need it. What are you going to do? What's your plan? And so the data product thing is sort of a very light version of that to me, where we hear about it. People know like, oh, we want our data to be like a product. We want to run our data like a product team. There's kind of, this is the new way of thinking, but it's not something that people have really pushed on as like what specifically that means. Yeah. That said, I do think that there is the general sort of like architecture you're describing makes sense to me of, okay, we kind of centralize these concepts in either semantics or entities or whatever it is that can be consumed by a Mode, a data robot, a buying propensity score, all those things. And it's all kind of built on the same stuff. I think that's probably right. How do we get there? I think we're going to like probably be fighting through a whole bunch of sort of different architectures for a while to see like what one actually makes sense.
That is I think in this year, the focus has to be on how to build these things. It's one thing to have this view. In fact, talking about how to build this, there are so many companies that are now starting up, for example, data contracts has bubbled up. And what are your thoughts about data contracts?
Like a high level, that makes sense, because basically it's just like a test. It's essentially saying, hey, like we want to validate the stuff before we put it in production. And it's like, yeah, okay, you've got some gates that as you're writing data through your pipelines, you should say, hey, this doesn't pass what we expect it to be. And therefore we shouldn't let it through the gate. And I think like, yeah, that makes some sense. The way that they are proposed. So to me, that is like not a product, that is like a development philosophy. That is the idea that we should create like cleaner ways for like basically bad data not to make it to production. Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's reasonable. In terms of how that actually is getting implemented, there's probably a bunch of different ways to do it. I suspect there'll be some like best practices that emerge there that are in the way that like pull requests became the way that we do. There became a tool that made pull requests really easy, and so that just became the standard for how people do like code development. My suspicion is that the same thing will happen with data contracts, where it's less about like, hey, we have a data contract vendor specifically that sells data contracts, but more of a tool will make it easy to actually put these things in place. And so those just become more like development standards for things that we want to do. And so that tool very well could be DBT. Yeah. If like DBT wanted to build data contracts, and where their data contract was, we write tests and then we create sort of a staging environment automatically that those things don't make it to production, your production models, unless they validate these tests, which they kind of do, but it's not exactly that. Like that to me is the sort of way this actually happens, is people like, oh yeah, we're just going to start using the DBT contract feature. Now we have data contracts, but it's not so much like because they built a product, it's more that philosophy makes sense, and somebody made it easy enough to live that philosophy without having to like, re-architect everything in some sort of novel new way.
So going back to DBT and semantics layer, why is there so much interest in semantics layer these days?
People started talking about it. I think part of it is we just go through these cycles. Like we went through a cycle, where it won't be interesting and it will be. And I think basically like the way that the data stack went was, we used to have sort of classic BI, semantics were very embedded in those. We realized that was a pretty, for better or for worse, something that created a lot of friction. There are a lot of tools that got built out to remove that friction. So like things like Fivetran, which throw out all of the transformation in the ETL process, basically say, hey, like let's just dump a bunch of raw data in a place and it'll be easier. And then tools like Mode or other DB or other BI tools made it really easy to work with that data directly as it is. And tools like DBT built kind of very lightweight semantic layers, but they weren't really like architected in the way that you would think of a sort of fully built out semantic layer in a BI tool. And so I think really what happened was we just like swung the pendulum way away from them, because everybody wanted to be able to do things really quickly. We wanted to be able to like work with all this disparate data sources and combine it all together really fast. And so now we're sort of paying the price for that a little bit and realizing, oh, the speed was really great. It was really powerful, but we suddenly kind of threw out the baby with the bathwater on terms of semantics. Oh, we need to reintroduce that. And so I think, like I said, at the beginning, the people like me who haven't been in the space that long are like, oh my God, we have a crazy new idea. What about a semantic layer? And everybody who knows what they're talking about is like, yeah, we did that 20 years ago. And so we all get excited about it and rebuild it in slightly new ways. But like fundamentally, it's just like we got rid of it because we thought it was in the way, and then we realized actually it was there for a good reason.
So your customers, when they use Mode, and so you made it easier now through semantic layer, you can get to data, you can visualize it. But how often do your customers come back and say, well, thank you so much, Mode, you made it easy for us, but our data sucks. We still have data quality problems. Do you see that a lot, or is it going down, is it going up? It just seems like, we've been talking about data quality for decades, and we just cannot seem to fix data quality problems. Any thoughts on that?
It's just like our eternal cross to bear. I mean, no, we certainly hear about it. We certainly hear about plenty of people who have like data quality problems, or it's less sort of data quality in the sense of like the data that we have isn't clean or good. It's more just like we've got a bunch of noise. We collected a bunch of trash, and now we're trying to find the things that are valuable in it. And it's like hard to do that. And not to say it's like trash, but we we found a bunch of things that's like we have a lot more noise than do we do signal, and sort of how do we parse through that. And so I don't know why. I think part of that's like an internal problem because data is messy. It's just like that's always going to be a lot of exhaust that gets produced, and it's hard to keep that clean. I think we will over time improve that. And I actually think, like as mentioned, the ChatGPT stuff, I think there is some potential for ChatGPT to actually make this better, because people are going to want to like train. If something like that becomes a thing that like we run our companies on these like LLMs that need to be fed tons and tons of data, or something that's sort of LLM shaped, that data needs to be reasonable quality. Like you can't just dump a bunch of garbage into that. Otherwise, when you ask it a question, you're going to get something that's nonsense. And so I think like that actually may be one of the impetuses for like, oh, we actually really care about data quality for everything, because we're dumping everything into this model instead of, well, as long as my revenue dashboard is good, I'm not actually going to look at the 99% of the other dashboards that it creates. So I don't know. There could be ways to improve it, but in general, I think it's just like it's a fundamentally messy problem.
Yeah, in fact, I strongly feel that the mistake Google's chatbot made when it showed that James Webb telescope was the first one to find a planet outside our solar system. I think any large language model that was trained on the same data would have made the same mistake. They were just showing some site somewhere mentioned that mistake.
Yeah.
And the model trained on that, so bad data quality is going to show up even in ChatGPT through Bing, and I think we're starting to see that happen already.
Yeah, I mean, there was this like kind of famous thing where it's like, how do you? I think it was like if you Google like how long does it take to caramelize onions or something like that, it takes like an hour, like an eternity. But there is something that like the like Google suggested result pops up and it's like 7 minutes. And I think it was basically pulling it out of an article that said like, it might have actually been an article that says, when you Google this, Google will say 7 minutes. It's not, it's actually 45. But like it identified this string as like, it's actually, it's 7 minutes thing. And so to me, that is the problem with what ChatGPT is as either a BI tool or honestly as search, is like, it's not good at finding facts. That's not really what it's good for. Like we wouldn't really think of it as being why we've decided to immediately apply it to like, let's go find facts, I think is kind of a mistake. Like, I don't think that Google should look at ChatGPT as a threat to search specifically. I think there's plenty of things where it can have a big impact, but it doesn't seem like it's a very good tool for, I don't know how much money we made over the last 10 quarters. Show me that. Like it's a probabilistic model. Like in some ways, you're always going to have, you're never going to ask, like that's never going to be, the model's not designed to tell you something with 100% probability. And like, if I can ask that, and you can ask that, and there's a probability that we get different answers, it seems like we've got a really sort of problematic tool for running a business. So I think there's lots of things that it could be doing in data, but that doesn't seem like one.
Yeah. And another interesting thing I was shocked to find out is if you run a Google search query, the cost to run that query is a few cents, like 3 to 5.
Really?
I couldn't get the exact number, but it's in that range. The cost to ask a question to ChatGPT today is 36 cents. That's expensive. Like if 100 million people are asking that, somebody is paying for that somewhere, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's $10 billion investment or the Azure hardware, but it's a very expensive process to ask these LLMs that are trained on thousands of GPUs. And so that's something interesting.
Yeah. So, and then like, I don't know. I think it's just not, it's a very good like creative engine. It's not necessarily a good for like a fact-finding engine, but I don't know, maybe we'll figure it out.
Yeah. So I have, so moving on, so completely changing the topic here, we see news of slowdown in tech funding and layoffs are happening. Are you seeing the effects, and what are some of the challenges that you see in our industry these days?
Yeah, I mean, so generally, there's a couple ways I can answer that. One is like, as someone who is involved in running a company, like, it's a tougher market. It's a tougher market just because everybody's a little bit more, everybody's basically paying a lot more attention to costs and things like that. And so, everybody's from running a startup used to be very much all focused on like growth. That's the only number that mattered. Top line was the only thing that you cared about. Now it's much more about like, are you growing the business efficiently? Are you profitable? If you're not, like how long until you become profitable? What are your margins? All those kinds of things. And so just like that side of things, it's obviously a very different world of running a startup today than it was a year ago. For like what we see from our customers and like what it for selling BI, like how are people responding to that? There's three main things I would say that we see in that one, buyers are much more sensitive to buying a lot of stuff. It used to basically be that if you want this tool and somebody else wants the other one, whatever, buy them both. Now there is like a lot of pressure around not strictly consolidation, but around we don't need two. That if the sales team wants to use Asana for task tracking and the engineering team wants to use Jira, maybe we should just have one tool and have everybody use the same one so that we're not having to pay double licenses. The same thing with like a BI tool or whatever. The second thing is sales cycles are much longer, not much longer, but like partly because people are evaluating things more and with more diligence. Like it just is a longer and tighter sales process where like the evaluations are much more focused. And people are trying to make these decisions, which one thing do we buy versus which three. The other thing I think is the real kind of pressure, I think, for a lot of SaaS companies is the businesses they're selling to don't grow nearly as much. And so there used to be kind of this dynamic where if you were selling a SaaS business or SaaS product, you got some natural growth because like the number of employees of a company you were selling to would probably grow. And so suddenly they're just going to go out and buy more seats of your platform. And now either those numbers are steady or they're going down, or businesses are like wondering, like, does everybody need this tool? So like Salesforce themselves added like 10 or 20,000, I don't remember the exact numbers. They added tons of people over the last couple of years. All those people are probably, they get licenses to various productivity tools that just make the growth of those tools within Salesforce like pretty easy. But now that kind of natural current isn't there anymore. Salesforce is cutting employees. They're probably like asking, do you really need this thing? And so SaaS businesses need to sell sort of like higher prices or basically sell more value that they can sell at higher prices, as opposed to just like riding this kind of natural seat growth is the easy way to grow.
I was having some very interesting discussions over this long weekend. We are recording this with some of my VC friends. So I learned stuff that really blew me away. So Ben, this is what I found out. So I've been hearing and reading that there's $300 billion of money that's parked by the LPs waiting to figure out where to invest in. That money is actually not 300 billion. Like my VC's friend tell me it's like $1 trillion, because all this money's been printed and it's just waiting. So now what's happening is the VCs are being extremely cautious where to invest the money, because if it doesn't grow, then they will lose their jobs and their reputation. So then they need to find very carefully which companies to invest that money in. On the other hand, the LPs are telling the VCs, look, you're not investing my money. I have all this money invested in you. I'm still paying you hefty fees.
Yeah.
And you're not making money. So I'm just going to take that money and put it in government bonds or CDs and get 5%. So this is a very interesting scenario. I was thinking money is like water, it needs to flow. And right now it's blocked, it's dammed. And that dam is going to burst, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly the way that people characterize kind of the fundraising environment then versus now, like then being a couple of years ago versus now, is very much around that, where it's people are looking for returns anywhere when interest rates are zero or very close to that, and the return you can get on government bonds or on sort of the more guaranteed, like the safe return was 0.5%, 1%, then yeah, VCs and sort of those alternative investments start looking a lot better. When that safe return is 5%, now it's like that essentially just means that VC has to return that much higher. And yeah, I think like the go make a bunch of wild bets on stuff, which is what people were doing, and kind of throw it at everything, suddenly doesn't have nearly the same appeal.
Yeah.
And so they're obviously more tight about like,
Right.
we want to invest in places we feel are efficient. We want to invest in places that we think will actually like be sustainable, instead of, okay, yeah, you had this high top line growth number, but the economics of the business may not actually make sense.
So talking about this, investing and funding. So we've seen over the last few years an explosion of new products, new categories. Is it sustainable? And do you see, are we going to move to, the pendulum is always shifting between centralized, decentralized. Now we're talking about decentralized, but then there's the integrated approach versus best of breed. What do you see happening in the market?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think it was like to me, all of these categories, they're kind of these small wedges in a big market, but not that big of a market, where kind of to your car point, the sort of car market from 100 years ago, there wasn't space for 130 companies, and there wouldn't be space for 24 categories of cars. Like, we don't actually need a car vendor that exclusively makes crossovers versus SUVs versus sedans. Like, that category of car is probably not big enough to be like a fully thing, like a fully defined category. It's kind of an attachment to these others. And so I think like what has happened is because there was a lot of easy money, because it was easy to go out and raise to start companies, because there was a little bit of interest in all these different products, and all you needed was a little bit of interest to raise money. Various like small niche categories could get started. They could sell to a handful of people. They could prove like traction to get to a couple $1 million in revenue, raise a bunch of money. And even if the market to me had stayed hot, there's just not a real business there. There's not a real, when you go out and raise $50 million, the expectation now is that you are a company that ends up making $100 million at some point in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Can a data catalog make $100 million? Can there be 10 data catalogs that make $100 million? Like, probably not. But I think that's kind of where we were and what we were funding. And so, no, I don't think that's sustainable. It's possible that it becomes like one huge one in all of these spaces, but kind of to your point, I think that really what happens is that becomes kind of folded into some of the bigger categories where, okay, people have a BI tool, they have a transformation tool, the catalog is kind of attached, and like, why not just use that one?
Yeah, so it's going to be, I feel, a hybrid. We're going to have decentralized domain ownership of data, but the infrastructure, I think, would centralize. Just my view. Which,
Go ahead.
So moving on to the next question about. So there are all these companies, and everyone wants to start this new idea. Then DBT comes along with a very simple model. SQL-based transformation with some, DevOps like features. What do you think? Like, how did mature vendors miss the DBT-like opportunity? And it became, and even now I see it has very little competition.
So I don't really know, but I think part of it was like, it was just very simple. And it looked kind of like stupidly simple to where, like, why would anybody really buy that? And so if you're a big transformation company, say you're Informatica, the idea of saying we're going to build something that just runs SQL scripts against your database and builds tables, to me feels like that's such a simple thing. Like, we solve all these complicated problems. Our customers we're talking to are probably using us to try to solve complicated stuff. Like, how would that very simple thing ever actually make sense? And so I think what DBT basically said was like, hey, we'll make this really simple. We'll solve a problem. They ended up solving it basically for like themselves. And what they opened up was a ton of people who couldn't use Informatica or didn't want to actually try to build these more complicated transformations into people who could just write SQL. And so it was like, yes, it was very simple. And to the audience that Informatica was talking to and selling to, it probably made sense to not build that thing, because those are people who could use the more complicated stuff. But what DBT built was like, oh, there's actually 10 times more people out there who can use that versus what Informatica was. And so, I think it was like it's too simple to be something that like makes sense as like a technology development for a company that's been really thinking about these problems and solving hard problems. But if you're somebody who's saying like, hey, we're trying to solve this for ourselves, and we think Informatica is too complicated, I think you can actually like see through that market pretty well. And in some ways, like obviously Mode is not really the same scale as DBT, but the thing that we built was kind of a rejection a little bit of the complexity of BI, where it's like we just wanted to write SQL and put charts on top. And like to a BI tool, it's like, well, don't you need all these models? Don't you need these more robust ways to like allow people to share it and more robust ways to like explore it? And it was like, no, we just want to write SQL queries and make some charts. And so I think like that very simple piece is part of the thing that makes it actually hard to see if you're trying to solve these more complicated problems.
Oh, very interesting. So Ben, I have so many other topics, but we're also getting close to the top of the hour. So I just want to ask you very non-technical about your blogs and just how long does it take you to write? Where do you get these ideas and inspirations? Because every weekend I start reading them and they're just full of all kinds of links and deep thinking. So how do you do this?
So part of that is I steal them. They're not they aren't like original songs, but more of kind of like mixtapes of ideas from people I talk to. So like they're very well, but like the conversations like this go a long way to be like, oh, that was an interesting thing that I've never thought about before. Let's maybe make its way into a blog post. And so there is an element of if you're someone who's like thinking about doing something like this, doing it makes it a lot easier because people have conversations with you about it. You'll talk to other people and you'll kind of always have these things in your head. And so like as you're thinking about it, you start to see lots of things that you wouldn't necessarily see if you're not kind of working on it. So part of it is just you have conversations, and I don't know, if you talk to people a little bit, you'll have plenty of ideas. As for how long, they are probably in total like 8 to 10 hours of work per post, I would say. Like from beginning to end. And it's, I don't, you don't sit down and can't do that in 8 hours. It's more of, I'll take a couple hours this morning to work on it. I'll take a couple hours this morning. I'll work on it this night. And then Friday morning, I'll panic and try to finish it. But yeah, it ends up probably like chunking up into about that.
I see. So this year, thank you for doing that, by the way. Those I've recommended it, and a lot of people have told me, wow, thanks for introducing us to blogs. People really like reading that. This year, we have Snowflake Summit and Databricks Summit on the same days. So where are you going?
Probably wherever the Mode team tells me to go. Possibly both for a couple days. They sell to slightly different audiences, and Mode is a little bit more of a Snowflake adjacent audience, I would say, than a Databricks adjacent, at least in terms of where they started. Snowflake started much more as like we are a database. We replace your database, except it's bigger and faster and cheaper. Databricks started more in like the kind of proper data science world, where it was kind of a data science platform for people to be able to run very like big jobs in kind of one centralized place. So that Databricks has moved much more in the like we would just want to sell a database type of world, I would say. But they tend to sell to folks that are a little bit more oriented in that direction. So, but I suspect we will have somewhat of a presence at both, and I suspect it'll be a last minute decision.
A lot of people want to know. People ask me on LinkedIn, like point blank, where are you going to go?
So which one are you going to?
I don't know if I want to answer it right now, but hopefully both, but time will tell.
Yeah.
So Ben, you gave us your background, how you were in DC and you were finance and economics, and then you became a founder. How was that journey? What lessons have you learned that you can share with the viewers?
So I don't know if this is actually making it into the thing. I'm working on got asked to do a thing about like telling people your biggest mistakes. And so like in the process of working on that. And I think there's a couple things in that that are related to this that I've kind of been thinking about. And one is like going through all those steps, especially in tech and in DC even more so. There's this kind of like natural current to if you do a job, you'll kind of keep getting pushed in the same direction to do these. So like, so say you take a data job. There are things that are sort of like the next expectation of what it is that you want to do. Of, okay, you're an analyst now, like kind of become a senior analyst and now run a team. And now after you run the team, go become like a kind of like a exec or a VP, become a CDO, whatever. After that, like there's sort of a career trajectory that you can follow and be reasonably successful by not thinking about it that hard. You have to like work really hard on the job, obviously, and like think hard about what you're doing, but you don't have to think that hard about like what's the next step. Like somebody will sort of open the door in front of you for you. I think one of the things that having bounced around a few different things and sometimes staying in a place for longer than I should have, and sometimes like making a leap probably before I should have, realizing basically like the value of stepping off the path and like making your own decision as to what is the next door to go through. Like it's very easy, I think, to get in the habit of just like choosing from the 3 doors that are kind of directly in front of you, because they will always be presented to you, especially if you do a good job, there will always be another door that somebody says, hey, try this one. But those doors aren't often the ones that make you happiest. Like there may be a door way over here that you have to like really make an effort to get to, or to like even just seek out to find. And so I think like having gone from the DC world into the startup world, into starting a company, and now like, going through that journey some, you realize like how helpful it is to sometimes like look off of the doors that are directly in front of you, basically.
Very interesting. All right, last question before you wrap it up. So every time I see you, you have a baseball hat, and this one is new. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, so I'm a Braves fan, an Atlanta Braves fan. This was the hat they sold right after they won the World Series a couple years ago. If you ever watch like a sporting event and it's like the Super Bowl, and like the first commercial after the game is over is like, buy your Chiefs swag, like celebrate the Chiefs 2023 Super Bowl. And every time I've seen those, I'm like, this is the dumbest. Like, who buys this? Like, these are the dumbest shirts. Why would I ever buy that? The Braves were the first, like, it's like the first sporting championship I've ever had a team of mine win since I was a kid. Immediately bought all of it. Immediately saw that commercial. Was like, I'm buying all this stuff. So, this was one of those things. Saw the commercial and was like, yep, okay, that's it. Like, I'm logging in and buying all this stuff right away. This was my Braves world.
So you lived in San Francisco for 10 years. You've now left during pandemic to live in Brooklyn, but you're a Braves fan and baseball is your passion.
So I grew up in North Carolina, so that was like country.
Got it. So last thing, tell us something about you that the world doesn't know widely.
So the baseball thing is probably one. I play a lot of baseball. I've played since I've been a little kid. The Braves hat's perhaps a giveaway a little bit. I can't hit. I pitch. I'm a terrible hitter. I have no interest in hitting. I know how concerned I am about hitting the batter when I'm pitching, so I don't want to be standing up there for that. I'm not trying to get pegged. But I still play like most weekends in the summer, attempting to hanging on as long as I can until my arm falls off, which is well on its way to doing, I guess.
That's great. Well, great. Thank you so much. No, this is amazing. Thank you so much for joining. I will see you in a month's time or so at Fivetran MDS.
Yeah, I will be there, and then I will see you in San Francisco or Vegas for Snowflake or Databricks, whichever one. Yeah, the audience will have to find out.
Yes. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure having you on this call. Really appreciate it.